Okay, so thank you very much and welcome back to the second part of the European Federation of Energy Law Associations conference looking at issues around the coronavirus pandemic. So it's a pleasure to welcome you back and we hope you enjoyed the first session. And just as a reminder, this is being recorded and will be available on YouTube afterwards. So please do share the recording with your friends. So we have a packed schedule this afternoon. We're going to hear from Italy, France, Norway, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Germany, and Austria. We will have a couple of rounds for questions. Any remaining questions will be answered after the event by the different countries, and the answers will be posted online on the Efela website. So it's a pleasure to announce the first speaker coming from Italy. So Barbara is going to start us off this afternoon. So go ahead, Barbara.
Thank you, Raphael. Before I start, I really like to thank the Efela and the organizers, Marinella for inviting me and Raphael for chairing. I'm really pleased to talk about Italy, where everything started, where at least after China, everything started. So first of all, I think that we cannot really understand how Italy coped with the pandemic without taking into consideration the complexity of our legal system. And part of this complexity, I must say, is set forth in or originates from the Italian constitution itself. Please remember that Italy is a regional system, so we have at least three different levels of government, the national, regional, and local one. And we do have a lot of local authorities, nearly 8,000 municipalities, just to give some numbers. So to cope with this institutional complexity, we really need to respect, as Marta Cartabia, the Chief Justice of our Constitutional Court, said a few weeks ago, to respect a very important constitutional principle, which is the principle of loyal cooperation among all institutions. But this public-public cooperation among levels of government, among all public authorities, is really not enough. What we need is a public-private cooperation, which is essential. If you think just about networks in the healthcare system, networks in the social care system, and we also need a private cooperation. And during the pandemic, this sphere, this cooperative sphere, was really important. All the anti-COVID measures and the social distancing measures were based on this kind of solidarity. Solidarity between employers and employees, solidarity between businesses and consumers, and solidarity and human-to-human solidarity. So this is the cooperation we need. Well, to cope with this, to regulate the complexity in, to regulate the pandemic in this very complex and cooperative scenario, our government, the Italian government, made use of law decrees. Law decrees are a primary source of law provided by our Constitution, Article 77, specifically aimed at coping with extraordinary cases of necessity and urgency. So what we need in case of emergency. But I must say that all Italian governments make a sort of ordinary use or ordinary abuse of law decrees, even in ordinary times, maybe just because we live in ordinary emergency times, this is to say. Well, this choice gave rise to what we can call a new COVID-related legislation, overlapping other very important sector-specific laws, healthcare laws, civil defense laws, and many others. we are talking about really a massive, huge legislative apparatus. 15 law decrees in few months, 165 implementing acts, which are only nearly the 20% of the entire amount of implementing acts we are expecting. So the 80% is still yet to come. And the total of regulatory decisions taken at the moment is of 305 decisions. So really a huge and massive corpus of COVID-related legislation. Seen from the bottom, from the perspective of, for example, a municipality, a local authority, this is what you would see, or what you see. A hyper-layered regulatory scenario. So legislation changes every day, and you have decisions taken at the very same day from different levels, at different levels of government. Not to mention that this COVID-related legislation makes use of sunset rules, but these sunset rules have been frequently extended and replaced. And there is soft law, which is essential, recommendation, guidelines, standards of behavior. And I must say, in front of this high-speed, fast-track legislation, law decrees are fast-track legislation, a sluggish implementation. So this is just to describe you the regulatory scenario of this COVID-related legislation. But coming to anti-COVID measures, we can see a very rapid change in anti-COVID measures. So if we stick to law decrees from February to May, what you see is a broader set of measures. At the very beginning, the focus was on health, saving life, but now the focus is on work, the focus is on social security, the focus is on economic freedoms, the focus is on the freedom of enterprise, and last but not least on energy as an essential good. And these rights, these are the rights, these are the freedoms which will be most affected in the very next future. So the next generation anti-COVID measures need to be focused on this kind of issues. Well, the energy market, I want to spend the last I have to talk about the impact of this anti-COVID legislation, anti-COVID measures on the energy market. First of all, the issue at the beginning during the lockdown was keeping the supply chain going. So, and gas industries and the ancillaries supply chains well declared essential services amid lockdown. And the issue here was to protect critical workers, for sure. The regulator, our regulator, the sector-specific regulator, played a really active and reassuring role for protecting vulnerable consumers, but not only consumers, even energy supplied, damaged by late payments by downstream customers, and also small and medium enterprises. But what I think is that now we need to go beyond the temporary measures passed by our government. Think about temporary measures for safeguarding key regulatory and administrative functions. The measures, the extension of the golden power regulations that already applied to the energy sector, but now extended to critical infrastructures, critical technologies, and supply of critical inputs. So this is not enough. What we need now is a new mix of measures for supporting the energy sector, the energy market, and the entire supply chain. As you know, many of you has already focused the attention of all of us and of the public on this. The lockdown measures have significantly impacted on the demand for electricity, and this is particularly true for Italy. There was a peak of minus 75% in March, so this is huge. And despite the increase in the residential demand, another change we need to focus on is the sharp change in the energy mix. Well, this is the context. So we can say that really the energy sector is under pressure, and as the president of the regulator, Stefano Vicente, said, all components in this scenario, all components of the energy sector, of the energy market, are closely interrelated, and even consumers are called to play a key role by payments in this very difficult and extraordinary period. The price cuts, energy price cuts may seem a good news, but you very well know that this is not, because this is a result of the economic slowdown, and not to mention the fact that these cuts may be very dangerous if sustained for a long period. The sharp energy mix change may already brought about, but will bring about a new cost. Talking about the past, there were extra costs for maintaining the electricity grid due to frequent congestions, and also we are expecting extra costs impacting on consumers due to the increase in renewable energies, so due to renewable incentives. In the very next future, it's really very important here again the role played by the regulator. The regulator shall play the role of an impartial watchdog, and he has just proved in the last few days to be able to do so by stopping an attempt to reform the role and the functions of the energy services operator and of the Italian national authorities for new technologies, energy and sustainable development. So what we really need in the very next future is a very impartial and neutral and competent watchdog. And I'm sure the regulator will be able to do so. Conclusions, coming to conclusions. I think we need to take into consideration some post-COVID trends impacting on the energy market. The post-pandemic, for sure, is the new normal. So what we call the post-pandemic reality is going to be the new normal, yet under construction. So here we need to cope with the smart working transition, as we all very well know. Smart working impacted on habits, transportation, and energy consumption for sure, and it will continue to play such an impact in the very next future. So what we need is a new integrated energy supply. We need new integrated energy supply contracts, products, services. There is a new energy poverty risk due to related to smart working. 5 euros per person per year are expected. And maybe in this respect, energy efficiency is the solution. We also need to keep emissions low. And here we need a very careful fiscal policy. And maybe energy transition funds are a possible answer, and very challenging answer to this. And some of you mentioned this during in the morning session. We also need to channel, and this is very important for Italy, especially for using well the EU COVID-related funds to channel economic aids into sustainable goals. So we need innovation-driven sustainability, which is key also to achieve Green Deal objectives. So we need reforms now in Italy to achieve all these objectives. And I think there is a good starting point, a new law decree, a simplification law decree, where some of these measures seems to be put in place. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Barbara. And I think some potentially exciting developments to happen in Italy. So moving along to the next speaker, Louis from France. So I think someone who has recently been awarded a new professorship and also co-director of the Energy Law program there with the great Philippe Ternier. So over to you, Louis.
Thank you, dear Raphael. Do you see my PowerPoint?
Yes. Yeah, okay. Perfect.
And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to thank the Efela'S and Marinella de Focatiis, Vicente, López-Ibor, and all the scientific committee for the invitation. I'm pleased to participate in this debate, and for my part, on the behalf of the AFDEN, the French Association, and more precisely in how France coped with the coronavirus pandemic. Like Barbara said, the subject is complex, and this complexity is due to two elements. The first difficulty is the interpenetration of the crisis. The health crisis will probably produce an economic and financial crisis in a global context of global warming. So there is a sort of conjunction of problems that requires cross-cutting responses. Secondly, temporality is essential. Crisis refer to the idea of a severe and sudden event, and the problem with COVID-19 is that it requires both measures to manage the emergency and to mitigate the deleterious effect in the long run. Understandably, there is a complex equation to be solved, and from France's point of view, it is this double dimension that I would like to question. Firstly, let us consider the legal management of the health crisis in France. In the context of the pandemic crisis, French public authorities have perceived the energy sector as strategic. Today, it is difficult to draw up an accurate balance sheet. Nevertheless, we can try to give an initial overview. For a legal expert, this means to identify the tools and therefore the legal framework put in place during the crisis and their relevance, and to unveil the strategies contained in this legal framework. In France, there is no specific text relating to the management of a health crisis in the energy sector. However, there are several texts or case laws that specify the measures that can generally be taken by the public authorities in the event of a crisis, like terrorism or pandemic. Concerning health crisis, following the SARS epidemic of 2003, the legislator had instituted a new mechanism to confer extensive power on the Minister of Health to deal with health problem, including an epidemic. And the first measures taken at the beginning of March were taken on this basis. But the situation was unsatisfactory. The Minister of Health could not bear the political responsibility for crisis management alone, and it was necessary to adapt the legal framework to the exceptional nature of the situation. For this reason, the legislator established a new mechanism known as state of health emergency, which could be decreed by the Council of Ministers and which gives the Prime Minister responsibility for taking the administrative police measures required by the situation. Concerning the COVID-19, the law has introduced the state of health emergency throughout the national territory for 2 months. And Act of 11th May 2020 extending the state of health emergency until 10th of July included. As of 10th of July, the state of health emergency has been in effect for 16 weeks. A law organizing the exit from the state of health emergency is currently under discussion in French Parliament. The originality lies in the fact that in order to avoid a too brutal exit, the government proposed a law of program exit from the state of emergency. The idea is to put an end to the state of public health, except for French Guinea and Mayotte, where it will be extended until October inclusive, because the virus is still circulating actively there. For the rest of the country, the text authorizes restriction on the movement of persons and the reception of public. From the very beginning of the crisis, some actors activated their national crisis cell as a preventive measure. For example, the public administration, like the National Energy Ombudsman, the Energy Regulatory Commission, or private operators, RTE, Enedis, EDF, etc. In general, each operator BCP is based on the mobilization of a part of the company staff to maintain essential missions. Each operator defines the perimeter of the essential missions concerning its public service obligation and the economic and technical realities. During the containment period, the following missions have been identified as essential. For example, you see the list, the production of electricity, in particular by EDF nuclear power plants. The difficulty of continuity of essential missions lies in the interdependence of the missions of energy operators. BCPs must be consistent, and that implies consultation and cohesion between the various players and between this player and their subcontractors. So as to enable operators to mobilize and allocate available resources to core tasks, public authorities have urgently adapted the legal framework to lighten the operator's obligation. For example, by postponing due dates during the health emergency period, except in sensitive cases. Concerning operator support for the national economy, 2 types of measures must be distinguished. Firstly, the binding measure. A law of March 2020 empowers the government to take various measures through an ordinance. In this context, the government has taken measures concerning the energy sector, like the postponement of the winter truce. Secondly, voluntary measures. Economic actors, whether or not concerned by legal measures, have sometimes on their own initiative put in place solidarity measures. For example, the immediate payment of invoices from suppliers and subcontractors in difficulty. What about post-crisis management? From a legal point of view, there are 2 exciting aspects here: to settle the dispute that arose during the crisis and to think the post-crisis model. Firstly, the AREN litigation. The AREN mechanism was designed to allow the emergence and the development of competition in the French electricity sector. Indeed, formerly, EDF held a monopoly. Today, EDF still owns a nuclear power plant that covers about 75% of the country's electricity needs at a very competitive prices. Access to the market was therefore difficult for alternative suppliers. This is why the public authorities decided to create the market by allowing alternative suppliers to buy energy from EDF, which is obliged to sell it to them at a price determined by the government. This price should be fair in order to compensate EDF costs, and EDF has thus become both an obliged seller and a direct competitor. The health crisis has led to a significant drop in consumption, and suppliers had to sell the electricity they had, but at loss. For this reason, some players, including Total, requested the activation of a contractual force majeure clause. This clause makes it possible to suspend the contract in the event of an irresistible, unforeseeable, and external event. However, EDF has refused to comply with this clause, and from this arose a dispute, which was the subject of the first two contentious decisions. Without going into detail, there are two main issues. First, could EDF refuse to submit to the request for a stay of execution of the contract? First question. Second question, did the COVID-19 pandemic constitute an event of force majeure? For the time being, the judge decisions do not answer this question because they are summary decisions. Finally, thinking the post-crisis model. The aim here is to identify the legal consequences of the crisis. Let us focus on two aspects. First, the compatibility of public aid with French and European law. The health crisis will have significant economic consequences. At present, in reality, it is difficult to assess the impact accurately. However, the government will mobilize significant funds to support businesses and strategic sector. And the energy sector is particularly affected, the energy sector as such, oil, gas, electricity, but also economic sectors based on energy, mobility, building, etc. And this aid mechanism raises two issues. Firstly, does this public aid comply with internal market law and in particular with state aid law? Secondly, is this public aid compatible with the environmental objectives of France and the EU? This question is complicated because this dual compatibility must be analyzed in its interaction. To conclude, the current health crisis allows us to design a new energy model and thus for lawyers to anticipate the legal obstacles to overcome. We can already identify two challenges. Energy decentralization on the one hand. Indeed, in this model, consumers themselves could provide services to the network and reduce the risk of a crisis occurring. And on the other hand, the sanctuarization of the environment in a constitutional norms. Indeed, today there is a temptation to environmental deregulation. As we have been able to do with fundamental rights and freedom, it seems crucial to devote to strengthening our legal edifice of environmental standards. The idea is not to make everything green, of course, any human activity, moving, building, necessarily has an impact on the environment. Nevertheless, the general interest of environmental protection has become paramount. It's a constitutional emergency. This presupposes that this transcendent interest should be the very foundation of the French and European social pacts. Thus, public authorities and judges will have a constitutional obligation to ensure that public decisions take into account the environment. This is a real paradigm shift to consider that the environment is our most significant common heritage and that social pacts must respect for nature. I would like to thank again the organization for this exciting conference, and thank you.
Thank you, and there was a very good presentation in identifying some earlier themes that we had before this morning, so such as was mentioned by Portugal about particularly looking at behaviour of some of the energy firms, so we can maybe watch what happens in France with EDF in the next year with particular interest. So next we'll turn to Norway and hear from Heinrich, who is very well known in terms of energy law around Norway and in terms of EU energy law. So over to you, Heinrich.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Raphael, and thank you to Efela for arranging this very interesting webinar and for inviting me to speak. I hope my presentation is now available on the screen.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about Norway. I will start just by briefly reiterating some specifics about the Norwegian energy sector, which distinguishes from a number of other energy sectors. Then I will just briefly mention a few developments that are actually not related to the corona pandemic, but nevertheless still very important before I go into the corona pandemic. And there I will focus in particular on one issue, and that is the petroleum tax amendments, which were decided by the Norwegian Parliament in June and which have created quite some discussion. First, the Norwegian energy sector in broad is really divided into two rather distinguished sectors. It's the petroleum sector on the one hand, which is an export sector and is still the most important sector for the Norwegian economy. I've included a few figures now here. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but the petroleum sector obviously contributes a lot to the Norwegian economy, both directly in terms of revenues from taxes and from direct and indirect ownership, and also more indirectly in terms of employment. These numbers are in billion Norwegian crowns, and 1 Norwegian crown or 1 euro is now approximately 10.7 Norwegian crowns. It's difficult to establish the number of people employed directly and indirectly. This is one figure, 225,000 people. Other figures are a bit lower, but the point here is that it's a very important sector also for employment in Norway. The electricity sector, on the other hand, is almost an entirely renewable sector. More than 94% hydropower in our energy mix. No significant gas resources in our electricity mix, which means that there is not really any sector coupling between the petroleum and electricity sectors. And the electricity sector is part of the Nordic wholesale market, and although Norway is not an EU membership state, we are an EEA contracting party, which means that we are part of the EU's internal market. And the fundamental principles such as the free movement, state aid and competition rules apply through the EEA agreement. And we also adopt most of the EU energy acquis, the secondary legislation, the third energy market package, for example, and we're now considering the Clean Energy Market Package and the Electricity Network Codes and Guidelines. These are some recent developments not related to the corona pandemic, but still important. First, just to mention that perhaps a bit surprising, the adoption of the third energy market package and the ACER affiliation, which was not decided until 2018 for the EEA, created a lot of public discussion, both in Norway and on Iceland. It was eventually adopted, and now we are working on the Clean Energy Market Package. So that's going to be interesting to follow what happens with that package, given the level of public discussion for the third energy market package. The largest controversy these days is perhaps related to onshore wind resources, which for many reasons were not profitable for many years, and hence there were not many construction projects in Norway. Now there is a thrust for new investments and construction, and that has caused a lot of discussion and controversies concerning the relationship between local interests, environmental interests, and commercial interests. Some adjustments to the Norwegian concession rules have now been proposed in that respect. A large number of our reservoir hydropower concessions are also subject to environmental revision these days, so that is an important aspect of the Norwegian electricity sector in the years to come. And finally, I would also just like to mention the Norwegian Climate Court case concerning the relationship between the so-called 23rd concession round for new oil and gas exploration and development licenses and the title in the Norwegian Constitution, Section 112 on environmental protection. It's a case raised by environmental NGOs challenging the award of new exploration licenses under the Norwegian Constitution, as well as human rights. The state won in the first two court instances, and now it's up for a Supreme Court in a plenary case in this November. So that's going to be interesting to follow. It's of course it's an issue that is being discussed more and more in Norway these days. The fact that Norway is on the one hand a large petroleum producer, and on the other hand keen to promote climate objectives. Now, in terms of the corona pandemic, it has, as been mentioned earlier today as well, obviously had large effects on energy prices, both in the petroleum sector and the electricity sector. In terms of petroleum, we saw that the price of Brent spot fell from around $59.60 a barrel in mid-February to less than $20 a barrel in April, and now the prices have caught up again to more than $40 a barrel. This is obviously not only because of the corona pandemic, but we've also seen other geopolitical incidents, and that has affected the prices. In electricity, even larger price fluctuations. I've included the Nordic system price here in June 2020 compared to 2019. If we were to look at the regional prices in Norway, the differences would have been even greater. So the prices are in Norway these days at the record low, at least for the last 20 years. The Norwegian government has reacted swiftly with a number of general aid packages and schemes. I'm not going to go into them in detail. It concerns, for example, compensation to employees subject to temporary layoffs, contributions to cover in part fixed costs for businesses. That may also have an effect for the electricity sector, since this can also cover in part electricity bills. There are tax and VAT delays and other measures. So these measures, while they are of a more general nature, also to some extent affects the electricity sector and energy sector. And then there are some more specific energy related measures. For example, the Norwegian Regulatory Authority have introduced an exemption for the grid companies, the DSOs, to reduce grid tariffs if needed, and a postponement of DSO functional unbundling requirements, which are now being developed, have also been signified in particular cases. Then there is the measure that is perhaps the most important and most discussed from the perspective of energy and the corona pandemic in Norway, and that is the petroleum tax amendments that were introduced by Parliament in June this year. Now, I am not a tax lawyer, so I should be careful to go into the details here. I would not have the competence to do so, and neither will I have the time. So I will try to keep it at a very general level. And at the general level, as a point of departure, there's a high tax rate on petroleum net profits in Norway, 78% consisting of a company tax and a 56% special tax. And conversely then, the state carries the larger part of the investment costs and other costs through depreciation and deductions in the tax system. The Norwegian petroleum tax system has for a long time been based on the tax neutrality principle, meaning that the tax scheme should be designed in such a way that it does not distort the investment decision of the companies. The ordinary tax scheme is based on 6 years linear depreciation for investments. And now it gets a bit technical, but since the investments have not been immediately deducted in full, but rather been subject to 6 years linear depreciation, we've had a specific deduction in the special tax base to ensure or safeguard the normal returns for the companies. And that is called an uplift. It's up till now been 20.8% divided on 4 years, so 5.2% a year. Now, what the Ministry of Finance suggested and the Parliament decided was as a temporary measure to allow immediate deduction of investments in the special tax base rather than have 6 years linear depreciation. And this was done to ensure liquidity in the sector for new investments, which in turn would also secure new assignments for the service industry and ensure employment for an important sector in Norway. When going from a system with 6 year linear depreciation to immediate deductions, the uplift does not anymore have the same function. So the Ministry of Finance proposed to reduce the uplift to 10%. What the Parliament did was not only to keep the uplift, but actually to increase it to 24%. This is technical, but what it means in practice is that a new form of deduction. Well, not a new form, but we have a deduction that has another purpose than originally. So we have a tax deduction for the petroleum industry in order, in particular, to ensure the service industry and employees. Then one could discuss whether this is the right issue, the right measure or not. On the one hand, ensuring employment in the service industry is clearly very important in Norway. On the other hand, I would say personally that, first of all, I'm skeptical towards actually allowing these kinds of tax deductions in a sector where we've always had very variable prices. Oil prices vary a lot for a number of different reasons, and earlier the Norwegian government has been very careful to keep the same tax system in good times and bad times. And from the perspective of resource management, I'm not sure whether it's a good idea to change course now. And then more so in terms of climate and the climate crisis, in a time when we need to an energy transition to other energy resources, I would say it's a particularly bad time to introduce new incentives for petroleum investments. But obviously, opinions on this will vary a lot. But my personal opinion is that this is the wrong measure at the wrong time. More recently, it also looks like we will have some amendments to the Norwegian resource rent taxation for large hydropower facilities in order to facilitate reinvestments in existing plants, but that is not as yet to be concluded. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Heinrich, and I think some of those taxation issues are very important to consider when this week I suppose in Europe there is the Just Transition Week, and we had the European Commissioner say yesterday the importance of the Just Transition and ensuring that we transition the workforce away from coal, oil and gas towards low carbon energy sources. So it would seem that with those tax deductions, there's perhaps a different motivation happening briefly in Norway, but definitely an area of further debate. But I think before we have a question or two, which we do have a few questions, I think we'll hear first from Switzerland, and then we'll take a question or two for the speakers. So we go to Switzerland, and Federico and Ilaria, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphael. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Federico Piccaluga, founding member of the Swiss Energy Law Association and General Counsel of Duferco Group. Duferco, through its subsidiary DXT Commodities, is a leader in the energy trading activity in Switzerland. First of all, I would like to thank the President and the General Secretary of Efela'S for organizing this webinar, which gives the opportunity to connect and create synergies amongst the national associations. I apologize that Professor Thomas Gauthier, who is the president of our association and a professor at the University of Bern, is unable to attend the today webinar due to a previous commitment, but he strongly supports the today initiative, and he will keen to participate in the future in any activities promoted by Efela'S. Before giving the floor to Ilaria Espa, founding member of the Swiss Association and a professor at the Swiss Italian University here in Lugano, who shall deal with the topic of the webinar, I would like just briefly update you in respect of our association. The status has been approved by all the founding members, which are mainly academics from prominent Swiss university, partners from external law firms, and in-house counsel. The founding members are from all the regions of Switzerland, Swiss German, Swiss French, and Swiss Italian. So all the regions are represented, and the Swiss culture is also represented in our association. Our launching event that was scheduled last March, unfortunately, has been postponed due to COVID, and we plan to do in November. So everyone is invited, and we will provide you the relevant info in due course. So thank you again for this opportunity, and Ilaria, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to Federico, and of course thanks to the European Federation for this opportunity to speak before you this afternoon. I'm not going to have slides, so I'm just going to briefly share some thoughts with you on Switzerland's response in the midst of the pandemic. And let me first say very clearly, somewhat in line with what has already been discussed this morning, and also by the first speakers in the afternoon session, that Switzerland's response to the pandemic has also neither been energy specific nor directly climate change substantiated. In this context, the COVID pandemic has rather played out in a way as to either accelerate or delay progress on some of the main constitutive elements of the already ongoing transition of the energy sector, which consists mainly of the revision of the so-called energy supply law for the electricity market design post 2020, which is going to accommodate the objectives that were set out in the so-called Energy Strategy 2050, which was approved by the Swiss people in a referendum back in 2017, and which mostly provides for the gradual phasing down of the nuclear energy, which has traditionally been very prominent in the energy mix in Switzerland, together with hydropower, as I'm sure most of you already know, and for the need to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy, also due to the phasing down of nuclear. Now, within this context, I'm just going to briefly touch upon three main points, which mainly relate to the specifics of the Swiss energy sector, and which allow me to also illustrate to you how somehow this transition has also been shaped, although indirectly, by the latest developments concerning the pandemic. So the first point I wanted to address is that we need to start by taking a step back and really be aware of the peculiarities in Switzerland, which mainly have to do with the fact that Switzerland has an extremely decentralized electricity supply system. It has up to 650 DSOs, which serve just over 5 million consumers. Most of them are partially or wholly owned by the public sector, notably by the cantons. As you know, we have a federal system and the municipalities. They mainly also operate as suppliers. They are not unbundled, so they basically retain a local monopoly. And this structure has generated many inconsistencies and problems, which of course I do not have the time to address here, but I'm just going to say that of course one of the shortcomings is that this system has led to a persistent resistance towards the full liberalization of the sector. And indeed, the Swiss electricity market is not fully open yet. We have a partial liberalization since 2009 with large end users that have been partially opened, but smaller consumers remain captive. The second phase, which should have brought the full market opening, was supposed to be concluded back in 2015, but again, there was a lack of political will, many delays, and the Federal Council had finally announced at the beginning of this year that we will proceed with that, but of course the COVID pandemic arose, and this of course caused further delays. So this is also how things have played out here in Switzerland, which leads me to my second point very briefly, and that is that the delays in the liberalization of the market have also largely determined a stalemate when it comes to the integration of the Swiss electricity market to the EU market. Now, you probably know that Switzerland has also, geographically speaking, a very key role in the energy sector, and you probably know already that Switzerland is a major electricity transit and exchange point. So, of course, this is much regrettable. Just to give you a few data, the electricity flows passing through Switzerland's border exceed the country's production and consumption, and cross-border electricity flows in Switzerland correspond to about 10% of the physical cross-border flows in Central Europe and Italy. So, of course, Switzerland plays a key role, and this is the reason why since 2007, Switzerland and the European Union have been under negotiations to conclude a so-called electricity agreement, which should have been instrumental for both sides. Of course, for the EU, Switzerland is central because of its balancing services to ensure grid stability, but also because it has extensive hydro pump storage and reservoir capacity, which would allow for the accommodation of increasing shares of variable renewables into the grid. And on the other hand, Switzerland is an as a net electricity trading position that is leaning towards a larger share of imports due to the fact that, of course, they are envisaging, as I said, a gradual phasing down in the nuclear power, which normally used to provide around 47% of the power that is generation in winter when hydro reservoirs run low. So, of course, this growing winter gap poses security of supply questions that can only be addressed through the integration of Switzerland's market with the EU market. Now, there's already been lots of trading, but Switzerland is excluded from market coupling because of the stalemate in the electricity agreement. And I should also mention that lately the EU has also requested that the conclusion of the electricity agreement hinges upon the institution of framework agreement, the so-called framework agreement, to govern all EU-Swiss market access agreement. So this, of course, adds a further delay of complexity and politics within the whole situation. And I should probably mention that the fate of these relations will depend upon the outcome of a referendum, which is envisaged for the 27th of September on the free movement of persons, which is sort of the Swiss Brexit. So if the Swiss will reject free movement of persons, that Switzerland falls into a UK type of situation, and all of the other 5 agreements that regulate the relations at the moment will be out of business, and you can imagine the prospects for the electricity agreement. And now, of course, the referendum is subject to the national sentiments in the country, even more so, especially during this crisis of the pandemic. Now, this leads me to my final point, which is that in the latest month especially, but this is an ongoing debate, questions on how to make Switzerland self-sufficient in electricity throughout the years, even including during the cold winter when it relies on imports of oil and gas from the rest of Europe, have really been revived. And here the discourse really intersects with the discourse on how Switzerland is going to meet its international climate commitments. And this is because, of course, the government is very keen on securing low carbon alternatives to nuclear power. And this leads me to just tell you in 2 seconds that we just finally, after many years of consultations, approved the revision of the CO2 Act, which sets basically the climate policy goals of Switzerland for the period from 2021-2030, and basically incorporates the goal of reducing by 50% below 1990 levels the emissions of greenhouse gas by 2030s. Now, how does this debate on self-sufficiency fit within the CO2 Act, which is most ambitious? And of course, I can talk about it further in the debate if of interest. Through these offsetting requirements. So basically in the CO2 Revised Act, we have an offsetting requirement which goes from the previous situation of 30% to 75%. This means that reduction will occur through internal measures, which makes it much more expensive to reduce CO2 in Switzerland than, for instance, when you spend money on foreign direct investment. How to do that? The Swiss government, of course, wants to expand hydropower as an important part of its strategy locally to meet domestic demand in the longer term. And just very briefly, they are envisaging, of course, support through prolongation of the market premium that is already there to basically support hydro at the time of particularly low wholesale electricity price, which do not allow to cover generation cost of hydro. And of course, this situation is also exacerbated by the COVID crisis, but also a recalibration and restructuring of water royalties of the quite complex system of water royalties that we have at the cantonal level in Switzerland. So just 30 seconds to conclude. You see we have a few developments in Switzerland in energy law and regulations, but they're not directly shaped by the COVID crisis. They rather derive from this transition that we are trying to shape, and which of course follows from the Energy Strategy 2050, the need to gradually reduce reliance on nuclear power, and hence the ensuing questions concerning security of supply, the need to accelerate deployment of renewable energy sources, also in light of the revised CO2 Act, and also in light of this ambivalence of Switzerland with respect to the issue of further integration with the EU, which has on the one hand caused a revival of the debate on self-sufficiency, and on the other hand has caused delays with respect to progress on full market opening and the signing of the electricity agreement. Thank you so much again, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your contribution from Switzerland as one of the newer members of the European Federation. And it's great to hear of some of the exciting developments in Switzerland despite COVID, but maybe from my own point of view, speaking from the UK, perhaps following issues around Brexit would not seem like a best way forward. But nevertheless, there is a question, I think, which will relate to all four speakers that we have. It's a question from Luigi from Italy, and I'm going to modify his question slightly, but that's not to take away from it. He is one of the rising Italian future energy lawyers. But in essence, his question concerns issues around when we think of government and maybe more regional action in a country. So I think it touches on a couple of points raised in terms of, Louis mentioned a French approach around decentralization of energy. And we heard Barbara, I suppose the question is addressed primarily to Barbara, but we heard the questions around investments and made by some of the other speakers. So if we think about that difference of, we think of post-pandemic, we do need government support to be behind energy investments, but at the same time we have these challenges of energy decentralization. We have maybe, as Luigi has pointed out, that maybe too often energy projects stop happening at the sort of regional level because there are sort of local politics at play that stop investments, etc. So I was wondering, could the four speakers reflect on that kind of those kind of challenges for new energy investments between sort of state, regional level post-COVID? So maybe starting with you, Barbara, first. So could you make the first remark, Barbara?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Raphael. Sorry, but the audio was off and I couldn't switch it on. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. And I should just add, make sure you make sure
thank
you all keep
for your question. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question. As I was saying at the very beginning, part of our regulatory complexity is rooted in our constitution. And coming to energy law and the energy market, we can say that energy law and energy market are somehow the victim of this constitutional complexity. So the energy field, the energy area scope is a shared competence between the state and regions. In Italy, we do have 20 regions. So the final output is that we have a very fragmented regulatory scenario, and this is not good, especially in times as the present one, when we have to think about the future and reinventing and finding new solutions. So what I don't see at the horizon in the very next future is the chance of a constitutional reform placing the energy back to among the competencies among the state competencies. So this is something I really don't see as possible, even because the attempt to reform the constitution and even this part of the constitution tragically failed in 2016 with very tragic political consequences. So I think this is not an option we have on the table. What the COVID-related legislation can do, being a national-driven legislation, and based on the draft of the simplification decree I was mentioning at the very end of my presentation, I think that the solution proposed by the government is played at the administrative level. So we are going to find a procedural way to simplify, radically simplify procedures for authorizing production plans, implementing the implementation of the electricity grid, and many other options. So I think the future, at least based on what the COVID-related legislation let us foresee, is to have just a form of administrative simplification driven and directed by the state. So this is the best we can foresee for the very next future.
Thank you. And now to Louis. So keeping it short to 1 to 2 minutes.
Yeah. In France, you hear me? In France, the post-crisis model has not been sought yet. And to tell the truth, the investment policy exists in the energy sector in France. Energy planning provides for support for renewable energy, solar, wind, but this investment not be enough to change the model. And I think that the real question is, does France want to change its model? And today the main debate in France is the place that nuclear power should occupy in the energy mix. And it depends on how you define the energy transition. Is it decarbonized and denuclearized energy? And in reality, the problem in France is that the political debate on this question has not been conducted. And there is also a question behind the question: what should Europe do about it? The objectives exist in the Green Deal and the Clean Energy Package, but to ensure a real European energy policy, the main energy producing infrastructure should, maybe, I take precaution, also be regulated at a European level, including, I take precaution, the French nuclear fleet. This is a very political issue, I think.
Thank you. And Henrik, do you want to say anything on the question?
Yes, thank you. It's a very good question concerning your regional involvement, and it raises a lot of issues. And I'm just going to, I think I'll just mention one to keep it short. And I was mentioning in my presentation the onshore wind controversies in Norway, and I think the lack of regional involvement is one of the key issues there, where the licenses are awarded by the central authorities, and the regional authorities are important hearing instances in that process, but nevertheless, we can see in hindsight that the involvement has not been good enough. Typically, we've had projects awarded license many years ago and then not built yet, and then technological development led to a situation where the windmills are larger, higher than originally anticipated, and they are giving a right by the central authorities to make those adjustments. perhaps not with sufficient local involvement. So that is certainly a very important matter in terms of construction and investments in new energy projects. I should mention that the Norwegian government has now very recently sent to the parliament suggestions for amendments of the concession regime here, trying also to strengthen local involvement.
Thank you. And the same question to Federico or Ilaria.
Ilaria, if you want to reply.
Sure. Yes, just very briefly, and perhaps this is my international trade law bias, but of course, when I hear, the question of government supports, in particular to renewable energy, and the issue of how to capture the benefits of these supports locally, an issue that comes to my mind and the tendency that I see through government's measures is the progressive diffusion of so-called local content requirements enshrined into this type of supports. And of course, with this tendency of looking into green jobs and using these COVID stimulus packages in this vein, we could anticipate perhaps a rising trend of this. And I would just flag that this may pose also compatibility problems with other regimes, in particular the WTO regimes. And we have an increasing number of cases that have been brought forward precisely because of the discriminatory components enshrined in these support programs.
Thank you. So I think we should thank Luigi for that very good question, and thank you for the 4 speakers just there. And we'll move on to the remaining 3 speakers, and they represent observing members of Efela, Luxembourg, Germany, and Austria. And I would say that, in terms of observing members, we do hope that some new members will join. We do have some people who are watching or who this webinar event will be sent to from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Hungary, to name just a few countries who this will be sent to. And I should also say that, the webinar will be made available to a number of institutions who we have held joint events with in the past: the European Parliament, the ECJ, Acer, and it will be an ambition that we do send these webinars to them to give a view of what we have been doing, but we also provide an overview of some of the key messages from around Europe that have been presented today. So there will be a short policy brief that is put together, and all the speakers will obviously be invited to contribute to it, and that will be sent to the same policymakers at those different institutions that I mentioned that we have collaborated with in the past. So there should be some hopefully good impact. But before we conclude today's webinar, we will begin with Luxembourg, and I'll hand over to you, Marc.
Thank you very much, Chairman Raphael. Thank you as well to Marinella and Vicente for organizing our meeting in representation to all the persons involved. Now, let me be very clear. My intervention is a strictly informative and descriptive one, strictly limited to the situation in Luxembourg in relation to COVID and energy. As an introduction, 2 remarks or very short remarks on the legal framework of the state of crisis. It is foreseen in Article 32 of our Constitution and allows only to take measures which are, I quote, necessary, adequate, and proportionate to the aim pursued. Now, our Grand Duke decided on the 18th of March to trigger the state of crisis for 10 days. Then the Parliament extended it to 3 months, and the state of crisis ended on the 24th of June. Now, for me, it will be impossible here to introduce, to go into details on every measures that were adopted by our government, but in a nutshell, just to give you a picture, there was a general lockdown, and the Luxembourg authorities took an enormous amount of social, labor, and economic regulations, which have general effects on energy, on the energy sector, and very few technical ones on energy law in Luxembourg. Now, several remarks on the general consequences in the Luxembourg energy sector. First of all, effects on demand of energy. The general lockdown made that electricity consumption fell. And let me quote our ministry. During the containment period, demand for electricity in Luxembourg decreased by 28%, particularly in the banking sector. And many actors in the tertiary sector have switched to teleworking without this having an impact on household electricity demand. The general situation was a little bit compared to what is going on normal, ordinary Sundays in Luxembourg. A second effect, a general one on the energy sector, and is also a little bit an answer on the question, Chairman, you did on the regional involvement. The source of electricity, the fact that renewable energies have priority over the grids, the energy coming from solar and wind sources in Luxembourg had increased during March and April. And I again quote our ministry, with 306 hours of sunshine in April, well above average for Luxembourg. The exceptional weather situation was one of the reasons for the historical peak of solar energy in Luxembourg over these times of emergency. Another general effect to which alluded already Barbara are the effects on the price of energy in Luxembourg. The electricity and gas suppliers see their income decreasing because yesterday the newspapers announced that the gas prices have dropped for 20%, electricity prices were stable, and gasoline prices dropped as well. These might be interesting for the purchasing power of consumers, but overall for society it might not be so positive. Last general effect is on the greenhouse gas emissions. You know, Luxembourg is not in isolation, and we all know that on a global level, the International Energy Agency predicted a fall of 6% in the global energy demand. So probably this will also be the case for Luxembourg. Now, let me turn to some very specific measures in Luxembourg's energy law. The first one is that there is an exception from the lockdown for the production and distribution of energy and petroleum products. The Grand Duke decided it from the first day on. This, of course, in order to guarantee the security of supply. Nevertheless, there are several more specific, temporarily, energy law derogations due to COVID situation. And the first one, and now I apologize to become quite concrete and detailed or technical. The first one is the possibility for companies active in essential sectors for the maintenance of the vital interests of the population of the country, which is of course the case for the production and distribution of energy. They might force persons to come to office. So there is a requisition of person which is possible for heads of companies to do. A second specific measure concerned the universal service. Now, in ordinary times, you know that electricity network managers must respond in 10 working days to any connection request and carry out the connection within, I think, a month or something like this. This mandatory period imposed was suspended until the end of the crisis. A third specific effect due to COVID concerns a procedural aspect regarding our regulator. In ordinary times, the regulator must respect what we call a consultation procedure before adopting some decisions. For instance, to designate the default supplier or the supplier for last resort. Now, during the crisis, the Grand Duke's regulation provided a derogation for the regular to use the consultation procedure and said a concertation procedure would be enough. Now, in practice, the regulator used this new possibility to only have a consultation procedure and not a consultation procedure twice, from the 9th to the 15th of April, and it concerns the suspension of deadlines. The Institute, the regulator, adopted regulations in the electricity and gas sector to extend the deadlines to find the new suppliers. Normally, it's limited to 6 or 2 months, depending on the voltage level. The regulator just said and extended the period by the duration of the state of crisis if these deadlines, 6 or 2 months, were to expire before the end of the state of crisis. This for the maximum duration for the supply of last resort in electricity and in the default supply in electricity as well in the gas sector. Another specific effect was postponement of the deadline for the designation of the default supplier for electricity and gas by the regulator. You know that every 3 years and for a period of 3 years, the default supplier has to be designated by the regulator. And a law of 18th of April said the validity of the duration of the designation of the supplier may be extended by the regulator. Now, I couldn't find out if the regulator has used this faculty and to postpone this period of 3 years. Another specific effect concerns the saving obligations on suppliers in gas and electricity sectors. You know that by the 31st of March each year, they shall report to the minister on the energy savings achieved. These deadlines for gas and energy were postponed to the 31st of May this year, which might be surprising, but because the 3rd of May was still during the crisis period. Last special effect on the smart meter installations for gas and electricity, there was also a deadline to report to the minister for the last December 2020. It was postponed to the last of December 21. General concluding remarks: no lockdown for the production and distribution of energy. Several very technical and more procedural specific issues were adopted, mainly to freeze the timelines. But please do not forget that all the other measures, not specially aimed at the energy sector, but for the whole society, are laws applicable to erga omnes, and these regulations potentially may have an incidence on the legal persons, the companies active in the energy sector. I think, labor law, or as was mentioned before, also tax law in Luxembourg, corporate law, possibility to have assemblies on the screen, and so on. Last but not least, the overall Luxembourg society, I think, has developed a high sensibility for low carbon emission policy. The government has already reacted by giving a state aid to buy electric bicycles and so on, and to favor the micro travel possibilities to go to work in Luxembourg. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And some very insightful opinions there from Luxembourg, but moving very quickly to Matthias from Germany.
Thank you, Raphael. Let me just start my presentation, and thank you very much. I hope you can see it now. Thank you very much to Marinella and Vicente for the opportunity to contribute a bit from the German perspective. Now, I would like to only want to speak about two elements from the corona-induced changes. Not surprisingly, they are to quite some degree similar to what we have heard already. One is the issue of public participation and corona challenges, and the other one is energy transition and corona costs. Now, what I mean by public participation procedure and corona, the energy transition leads to many energy installations having to be replanned, extra high voltage lines, wind turbine installation, possibly later on some new gas power stations. All these installation planning and permitting procedures require participation of the affected public. Just to name a couple of the sort of European law or European law related bases is the Aarhus Convention, the Industrial Emissions Directive, and the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive. And depending on the participation method, coronavirus related restrictions do actually make it difficult or even impossible. At the same time, we do need, under European and German law, effective public participation to enable the public to express and the decision makers to take account of the opinions and concerns which may be relevant. Talking about coronavirus restrictions, practical examples I've encountered in procedures that I've had the pleasure advising on is restricted access to places where fires could previously be inspected. So an office space that was closed, people were not there because of remote working, so you just could not inspect the files. When we have public hearings, were restricted maximum numbers of people at events, and the question was whether the coronavirus related questions also prevented people from doing that. Contrary to a gentleman in the US who thinks that 9,000 people should be in a room, I think the view that was held here in Germany was that does not really make sense. Minimum distance requirements also make it necessary to have big venues if we actually do decide to have people in the room, and hygiene requirements also are quite challenging if you have those major hearings. Historically, Germany had a rather two-pronged standard public participation approach. So a paper-based version, you have to make available documents in paper for the public to inspect the documents and then to comment on them. Digitalization has also made its way to Germany, but the internet availability was an add-on. The actual legally binding part was the paper version that was available for inspection. Then once people had commented on them, the standard procedure in major permitting procedures was to have a public hearing where the applicant or public officials, people who have commented in other affected parties actually participated. And if it was a major contested project, that actually meant that you have lots of people who could appear in hearings. While the sort of internet-based solutions were not excluded by the law, that was in reality not done. In all events, these two elements had involved personal physical contact and were at least difficult and partially not possible. And it soon turned out that if we wanted to continue with the energy transition, we needed to come up with something, because it was not really desirable to have large numbers of people in places to discuss and debate and comment on energy procedures. So the reaction was to increase the digitalization of public participation. A new Planning Assurance Act that inverted the version, or allowed now to have primarily internet-based participation plus paper on top of that. This is actually only a test balloon for the time being. Technically speaking, it only applies until the end of March of next year. I personally think that this is one of the Corona-induced digitalization changes that we will have for good. I don't know yet, but this is sort of one practical consequences, an acceleration of digitalization and public participation procedures, which I think is good. The new rules then make it possible. As I mentioned, the documents can be made available on the internet. Hearings may, under certain circumstances, waived or replaced by online consultations. The online consultation is actually a new instrument for the German administrative procedure. Details are still somewhat unclear. In particular, you can actually change from online consultation to telephone or video conference, but you need the consent of all affected parties, which of course in contested energy projects is somewhat difficult to get. We will see how that will work out in the future. The second element I want to touch upon is something that we've had in various presentations already relating to the energy transition and cost. This is the figure some of you may have seen, the increase of renewable energy in Germany. So far, so good. So quite a substantial increase. Well, a combination of various factors at the beginning of the first half of this year, but including Corona, led to renewable generation soaring to above 50% as it looks now in the first half of the year, which is of course a good thing on the other hand, but looking at that also has some, and I'm going to look at the commercial consequences. The chart that you are seeing now shows you in green what we call the EEG surcharge. The EEG surcharge is an amount that in principle, every energy consumer has to pay per kilowatt hour consumed. The red part is the power exchange spot price for electricity at the same time. So when this all started, like a while ago, the EEG surcharge was less than half than the power price. And then we had in 2016, the power price actually was half of what the EEG surcharge was. And for 2020, people were planning with an increase of the spot exchange power exchange price, and which would have led to a rather lower or not so much increased EEG surcharge. Now, 4.93 cents per kilowatt hour was the plan. This is the prices that we had this year. So you can see here very easily that, and we've seen that on other presentations already. I think, Marinella, you started off with that the prices have come down all over Europe, which means that the costs of renewables actually go up, or the EEG surcharge would go up if you have an increase in renewables generation. A decrease in industrial power consumption means that there are fewer kilowatt hours that have to bear an increased amount of money for renewable energy. Well, we would have had the EEG surcharge, so the surcharge that people would have to pay for renewable energy was likely to increase by 20%, maybe 30%, to actually get this increased renewable energy production transferred in terms of costs to consumers. This development was considered to be politically very undesirable. So if the actual power price was in the range of 3 cents and the EEG surcharge is like twice or 3 times as much as the actual price of the power, that would have been undesirable. And this came in connection with a discussion: how do we change renewables financing in Germany? Now, the Corona solution, as I've called it, is to partially change renewables funding to tax. And this is being sold politically as a cap and reduction of the EEG surcharge. So the plan is to cap the EEG surcharge, so the amount of money that people have to pay per kilowatt hour, to 6.5 cents, and the year after to 6 cents. The price tag that has been attached to that is 11 billion euros. So we have 26 billion in transfer payments under the EEG surcharge per year, and this tax part is probably 11 billion. Very interesting question that has hardly been debated, but we will surely see soon, is what is the legal consequence of this partial tax funding? You may recall this decision of the European Court of Justice, somewhat surprising, that the EEG surcharge was not state aid, basically using the Preußen-Elektra argument, because the reallocation system for the EEG surcharge is not state funded, is only monitored by the state, and no public control over the funds generated by the EEG surcharge. Now we will have a major part being directly funded by tax. This will, of course, again raise questions of state aid. We've had that from other countries, and the emergency measures through COVID-19, induced by COVID-19, will be reviewed one way or the other under state aid law. This German way of approaching the capping of renewables costs, as it is directly visible to the public via the EEG surcharge, is likely to cause some further debate. So thank you very much. I think those two elements I thought I would raise. There are, of course, several others that Germany has, as much as it has in the other countries, but I thought this discussion might be helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And I think, you know, an interesting debate, which I think follows what Marc said earlier in thinking about the broader nature of how energy law essentially is being affected by other areas, and also vice versa. So this brings us to our final speaker from Austria. So welcome as another observing member of Efela. I'll hand over to you, if I get the pronunciation correctly. Is it Bernd? So you just have to unmute your microphone.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this introduction. You pronounced it correctly. It's Bernd Rajal. Thank you. Can you see my presentation on the screen now?
Yeah, just turn it into presentation mode. Thank you.
Okay. So, but you can see the presentation. I can do it like that as well. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Thanks a lot. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this webinar. It's a very interesting one. I'd like to report on the impact on the Austrian energy sector, and starting with my first slide, which actually shows the impact on the energy consumption in Austria. As you might know from the media, Austria was one of the first European countries taking lockdown measures after Italy. So at a very early stage, starting as from 16th of March. And you can see here a comparison between the decreases of electricity consumption in Europe. Austria is in the middle field with 14%, whereas Germany, which has taken the lockdown measures at a later stage, is at 7%. However, also other countries are heavily hit. You can see that also from the decrease, like in France, for instance, which is a bit higher than in Austria. Also, in the gas sector, we have seen that final customers consumed 10.7% less natural gas in April compared to the previous years. And we can see now, I have now received just today, received new figures on the decrease in electricity consumption and also in gas consumption in May, where actually the lockdown measures in Austria has already been lifted to a large extent. And you can see the electricity consumption is somehow again recovering, only showing 11% minus compared to the previous years. Whereas most interestingly, the gas consumption is 18% less than to the previous year in May. So you see the gas sector especially is heavily hit, which is mainly driven by the fact that the gas-fired power plants are not running, and also the industry is still suffering from the lockdown measures. With regard to gas storage, you know, Austria has a lot of gas storage capacities. Here we see that 43.5% of the storage capacities are used in May. That is pretty much, it's actually the highest percentage we had over the past 20 years. We have also seen energy prices for household customers stayed largely the same. Of course, the wholesale prices were subject to a substantial decrease. What we have seen in the law practice, of course, as a result of the pandemic, regulatory measures taken, more and more companies facing delays or even the inability to meet their contractual obligations due to mainly financial reasons or other reasons. And the energy sector is not exempt from these events, and therefore we see a lot of requests in advising on contractual implications, namely, is this an event of force majeure or not? And this, according to Austrian law, heavily depends. What is the contract? What are the provisions of the contract? Is there a force majeure clause in place? How is it going to be interpreted? And even if there is no force majeure clause, then force majeure could be actually successfully claimed if certain preconditions are met. Most interestingly, in 2005, the Austrian Supreme Court actually has dealt with the SARS pandemic and actually confirmed that the SARS #1 actually is a case of force majeure. So we actually expect from the Austrian courts that the coronavirus SARS-CoV-19 will also be considered as a case of force majeure. Special governmental measures, the colleague from Luxembourg has already mentioned comparable measures. We also, Austrian government has foreseen a suspension of statutory and administrative deadlines. That was also very relevant to the energy sector, since, for instance, the Austrian is expecting the introduction of a new gas market model next year, which is actually related to the appointment of a new balancing group coordinator, which is subject to a tender procedure. So, for instance, this tender procedure was postponed because the application for the tenders was suspended. So you see that's only one example of practical consequences of the COVID crisis. Secondly, the obligation to pay contractual penalties was suspended by law until 13th June if contracts were concluded before 1st of April, and if the obliged party defaulted because of its economic capacity, is substantially impaired, or is unable to fulfill obligations due to restrictions regarding economic activity. And last but not least, there was also a provision adopted by the government that actually the energy companies are not allowed to switch off energy supply, to cut off customers due to payment default until 1st of July. Since we are running out of time, just a quick outlook, because this is maybe the most interesting one. Actually, Austria is expecting that the GDP is going to shrink by 7.2% due to the crisis. And as you might know, that we have a mixed government consisting of Conservative Party and the Green Party. And it's not a big surprise that actually the Green Party is now pushing for addressing the upcoming economic crisis by pushing the energy transition. We are actually, the government is planning to publish the first draft of the Renewable Energy Expansion Act in the next 2 weeks. And we actually expect that this draft is already taking into account the need of really massive support to renewable expansion projects. That's why we see here a lot of upcoming exciting developments. So what we have heard, and which is also was already included in the governmental program, that the renewable capacities should be actually expanded by 27 terawatt hours until 2030. That's quite a lot for a small country like Austria. Also, the definition of the so-called renewable energy communities in accordance with the new renewables directive from 2018. You can see that here the government will also push that these renewable energy communities are going to be established. And most interestingly, as you might know, the directive says the renewable energy community needs to be the participants and the members need to be in the proximity of the renewable energy plants, and it's up to the member states to define what is actually in the proximity of the of projects. And according to rumors, the government is planning to define, so to say, the border of the renewable energy community at network level 5 or even 4, and so that's quite a huge area. We have also expecting facilitated network access for small renewable energy plants, actually replacing an approval procedure by a MER notification procedure. And also Austria is going to introduce a competitive procedure for tendering new renewable capacities in general, especially for solar, but a big exemption. Actually, the wind industry should still benefit from an administrative market premium. So we actually expect that for wind, there will be no competitive renewable auctions, which is quite unique in Europe, as far as I know, since actually all the wind projects are tendered in a competitive procedure. And also, last but not least, mandatory renewable gas quota of 5.6% is expected. And all of this you see, and there I would like to conclude that actually I think the biggest impact of the COVID crisis is in the future, since actually the Austrian government is to plan to push the economy and to handle the economic crisis by accelerating the achievement of renewable energy goals with this new law, which we are expecting in the upcoming weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and it's great. Again, I think we heard a few exciting sort of developments in some countries in the morning. It's great to finish off on a very positive note for the low carbon energy transition in Europe. And just to be very brief, we are running out of time, so I'm going to just ask the final three speakers a very quick question. Feel free to give me a yes or no answer. Try and keep your answer within 60 seconds maximum. So the question which has been suggested to me is, when we think of the low carbon energy transition happening in Europe at the moment, and I think this, definitely Bernd highlighted a lot of positivity happening in Austria, but I think maybe Marc and Matthias highlighted other issues around low carbon energy developments in their countries. But should we reconsider what the subsidy should be in the European energy market when we think of these new low carbon energy products that come in for the medium to longer term? Not only do they create jobs, but more importantly, from the medium to long term, they will reduce, let's say, the costs to our public health system, because we will have a lot less pollution. So considering the pandemic in mind, the link with the pandemic and environmental damage, etc., should we see renewable energy or low carbon subsidies in the same light, or should we see them essentially as positive subsidies that our governments should support even further? So I'll start with Marc first.
Yes, I think it is definitely a yes. There might be an effect on the health, because not everybody knows how to go on bicycle, and they might then have difficulties. But the answer is yes. From the Luxembourg point of view, yes. Yes.
Good. Thank you, Matthias.
I think the answer is also yes. But at the same time, I think it is sometimes helpful if from the European end, national initiatives are being reviewed, whether what is claimed to be the reason for something is the real reason, and whether it actually does not unnecessarily contort competition between the member states or adversely affects the situation between the member states. So yes, but with a little but.
Thank you. And lastly, Bernd.
Yes, also from my side, a clear yes, and just can underline what Matthias said. I think we had some bad experience in the past with the renewable support schemes, with the national support schemes in terms of market distortion. This needs to be avoided in the future. But apart from that, I think it's really worth to invest into this sector and also to have governmental support continuing. And yes, and just a final remark, I'm really curious if now Austria decided for this administrative market premium, avoiding competitive procedures in the wind sector. Really looking forward to the notification procedure before the European Commission.
Thank you very much. And just before we finish, I would say it's a pleasure to have been moderator today. And you can follow both videos that will be online on the Efela website. Do keep an eye out on the Efela website for future events that are planned. And I'd like to thank all the speakers who spoke here this afternoon, from Barbara, Henrique, Louis, Federico, Marc, Ilaria and Bernd. Thank you very much. And I'll hand over to our president to say the final words today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Raphael, Professor Heffron, and thank you so much for driving so skillfully this very interesting conversation that we have during the morning and during the afternoon. This final note should be necessary very briefly, is a note of gratitude to all of you, for the participants, that they were very loyal in the attendance of our conversation. For the speakers, that definitely you were very talented. That was something that was anticipated by our friend Peter Cameron. For our Secretary General, always tireless in the supporting our initiatives and activities, from the design to the implementation and execution, taking care of any minor detail of our organization. Thanks so much, Marinella di Focatiis and all the Italian team and delegation. Congratulations to the Swiss new association. Very much welcome to Efela, and also welcome very much to the Austrian representation as observing member. We are very happy that you decided to participate in the Efela activities. As Raphael was mentioning, we are so convinced that in the next future we will have many members observing and full members in the Efela organization, in the Efela boat. I think it's an entity very much useful at this very moment, with high quality from the professional experts in the field of energy law. Thank you very much, Dr. Marc Jaeger, for coming to our meeting. It has been an honor and a great pleasure having you again with us and joining our experience from the Luxembourg delegation. And thanks so much to all of you, Matthias, Louis de Fontenelle, Ilaria, Henrik. Also, I'm very happy to see you with us, and Barbara. Thanks a lot. As we can clearly see, there has been many common elements in the discussion with this massive corpus of law in the energy law, or affecting energy law, from the general perspective or from the pure focus on the energy regulation during this COVID period. Very much unexpected and very much difficult, with a very large list of categories of measures coming from the constitutional provisions and perspectives, according if some countries has decided to take a state or declare a state of emergency, alarm or calamity, to taxation, to the social measures, particularly with regard to the protection of vulnerable populations, to the business facilitation with regard particularly to the small and medium companies and to the autonomous workers. Climate and environmental was another part of branch of law very much correlated, and contracts, of course, and public procurement law, even litigation that was mentioned in different from different contributors, and tech and digital law. So from constitutional law to soft law, to guidelines, to guides in the field of COVID. I believe that we should remain particularly vigilant to the future on that regard, and to make this double test of necessity and proportionality on the rules already adopted, and to be also attentive of the ex post facto development of these rules and regulation. Ivone rightly asked herself about, and then what next? What's going to happen in the following weeks and the following months? Always is difficult to make predictions, as we've seen in the recent past, particularly when we have to refer to the future. Robert Samuelson, first recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, quipped, "Economists have predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions." So we have to take care about that. However, I think for the energy law, we have excuse me, I think I had so many enthusiasm and then I touched the screen. I was saying that I perceive some overlapping in the correlation between some part of the COVID-19 package and the energy transition. And I think now we have to be particularly focused on the energy transition and all this legislation to be adopted by the member states, taking into account and emphasizing that the legislation coming from COVID is a provisional one, and it should have this type of life and this type of time frame. So finally, what I wanted is to express, as I said a few seconds ago, my gratitude to you all with one announcement. As you know, before the end of the year, we are going to announce the date and the location, perhaps virtual, we don't know yet, of our second Efela Congress, focus on state aid and clean energy package. And also one request, a very kind request to all the delegations and the national associations from Efela, that if you are so kind to send the internal legislation produced during the COVID period and to send it to our website, even in the national languages. I think it would be extremely useful for everybody and to check and to have the possibility to access to all this. So thanks once again to all of you. It has been a super pleasure sharing with you and exchanging with you during this very long conversation. Congratulations, Efela, to all of you and to all of us for this seminar. Thanks so much. I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.